Today, DNA scientists are closer than ever to proving that the lost colony of Roanoke may have actually survived. If their theories are correct, descendants of the colonists must still exist, likely with mixed Native American and English ancestry.
In 1590, 115 English settlers vanished from the Roanoke Colony, leaving behind no bodies, no signs of violence, only the word Croatoan carved into a post. For centuries, it was America's oldest mystery. Now in 2025, that silence has been broken. A burial, DNA proof, artifacts buried deep in tribal lands. The truth? They didn't disappear. They were absorbed. Forgotten not by history, but by those who chose myth over memory. And what we've just uncovered doesn't just rewrite the Roanoke story, it reveals something far more uncomfortable. They survived, but we chose not to see them. Until now. The disappearance that changed everything. In August 1590, a ship arrived at Roanoke Island with hope. John White, an English artist turned governor, stepped ashore after 3 long years away. He had crossed an ocean to return to his family, his daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 settlers he'd left behind. But instead of a reunion, he found absence. The colony was empty, not destroyed, not looted, just abandoned. The wooden palisades stood tall, tools were stored neatly, no blood, no graves, no bodies, no sign of a struggle, just an eerie quiet that settled into his bones. The only clue? The word Croatoan carved into a wooden post. No cross, no distress signal. That had been the plan on Chan. If they were forced to leave under threat, they'd mark a cross, but there was none. Just that one word. White knew what it meant. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, home to a friendly Native American tribe. Maybe they'd gone there, maybe they were safe. But before he could find out, storms forced his ship back out to sea. He never made it to Croatoan. He never found the settlers. He never saw his family again. "I found not one soul, nor any certain token of death," he wrote in his journal. And just like that, 115 men, women, and children slipped into legend. Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil, vanished without a trace. Alongside her, a community disappeared into thin air. No letters, no graves, no explanation. Only questions. Did they run out of food? Did they move inland? Were they attacked? Or did they choose to leave? Historians, explorers, even amateur treasure hunters have searched for answers for over 400 years. But the longer time passed, the more the facts thinned and the myth grew thicker. The Roanoke Colony became America's first unsolved mystery, a ghost story dressed in historical clothing. And it all started with one word scratched into wood and a silence no one could explain. And that single word, Croatoan, would go on to spark one of the most enduring legends in American history. Croatoan and the myth that followed. After John White returned to England, the word Croatoan became a symbol, not just of where the colonists might have gone, but of everything we didn't know. Croatoan was real. It was the name of a nearby island, now known as Hatteras, and home to a Native American tribe that had been friendly to the English. It made sense at first glance that the settlers might have fled there for safety, but John White never got the chance to check. The weather turned. His ship, battered by storms, was forced back to England, and he never returned. So the mystery deepened. For centuries, people guessed, some carefully, others wildly. Maybe the colonists were killed in a raid. Maybe they starved. Some even claimed Spanish forces wiped them out. A few believed they were cursed, doomed from the start. Theories multiplied like shadows on a wall, each one bigger than the one before. Meanwhile, oral stories from the Croatoan people told a different tale, one that no one seemed to want to hear. Their elders passed down accounts of light-skinned children with gray eyes, of strange new words entering their language, of families that didn't look entirely like theirs. These weren't ghost stories, they were memories, woven into culture, into tradition. But colonial powers and later historians ignored them, choosing instead the drama of disappearance over the quiet reality of assimilation. "They lived among us," one elder would later say. "They became part of us." But facts were boring. A vanished colony made better headlines. And so the story of Roanoke became less about what might have happened and more about what people imagined did. By the 1800s, writers and amateur historians had turned the colony into myth. The word Croatoan itself took on a kind of haunted power. Edgar Allan Poe reportedly whispered it before his death. It showed up in lost ships, strange disappearances, even horror stories. But through all the fiction, the truth lay buried in the soil of the island. No one bothered to search. Because the problem with legends is that they often grow too big to be challenged. But some refused to let the mystery go, and in time, scattered clues began to surface, ones that would slowly start to challenge everything we thought we knew. The hunt for clues through time. Long after Roanoke had faded into mystery, quiet clues began to surface, just not in the places anyone expected. In the early 1600s, Jamestown settlers reported something strange. In distant tribes, they saw children with gray eyes, unusual speech patterns, and even glimpses of Old English customs. Some tribal leaders claimed descent from white ancestors. Others spoke of families that lived differently, names and habits that didn't quite match. These weren't ghosts. They were people, living memory, but no one connected them back to Roanoke, not yet. Then came the Dare Stones, a series of carved rocks discovered across the American South in the 1930s. They told the story of Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, and her survival after the colony's collapse. The first stones sounded real, but others, clearly forged, buried the story in doubt. A lie mixed with truth still smells of fraud, one historian warned. And so the stones, real or not, were discarded. Meanwhile, archaeologists kept digging, literally and figuratively. But Roanoke remained elusive. Too much time had passed. Sites were lost to erosion. Forests had swallowed structures. And most historians didn't think to trust the tribal oral accounts that quietly persisted over generations. Technology was the missing piece. And in the 21st century, science finally caught up with the story. Old legends weren't enough. The search needed something new, something hidden in plain sight. That breakthrough came not from the ground, but from a map. The secret hidden in a map. In the quiet archives of the British Museum, a forgotten map waited. It was drawn by John White himself, one of the earliest maps of the Carolina coast. For centuries, it had been studied, copied, and displayed, but no one had looked close enough. Then, in the early 2010s, a researcher noticed something strange beneath the surface. Literally, under a patch on the map, visible only with modern lighting and analysis, was a faded symbol, a star-shaped fort located about 50 miles inland. It matched exactly what White had written in his journals. If the colony had to move, they would relocate 50 miles into the Maine. "We think it was hidden deliberately," said the researcher. Some believe it was covered to avoid detection by Spanish spies, who were also operating in the area at the time. Others see it as a kind of coded trail left for future explorers. That site would come to be known as Site X, a quiet patch of forest near the Albemarle Sound, overlooked for centuries. It was the first real lead in over 400 years, and it pointed not to failure or vanishing, but to movement, a choice. The idea that John White may have known more than he let on, that the colonists didn't disappear, but relocated quietly, suddenly didn't sound like a theory. It sounded like a plan. But paper clues weren't enough. To confirm the story, they had to dig into the ground itself. Site X, shadows beneath the soil. When researchers finally began digging at Site X, they didn't know what they'd find. The map hinted at a fort, maybe a temporary shelter. What they uncovered was far more revealing. Just beneath the soil, layered in time, lay fragments of English pottery, unmistakably Elizabethan in design. They dated back to the late 1500s. These weren't trade items or scattered trash from later settlements. They were domestic, used, worn, part of someone's everyday life. But something was missing. No clay pipes. In the 1600s, English colonists almost always carried and used tobacco pipes. They were everywhere in Jamestown, but not here. That detail, oddly specific, became a timeline marker. Site X wasn't post-Jamestown, it was pre-Jamestown. That meant these artifacts belonged to a group that lived here before 1607. Only one group fits, the Roanoke settlers. These weren't explorers passing through, said one archaeologist. This was long-term living. Ground-penetrating radar revealed more. The faint remains of post holes, hearths, and storage pits. Structural features that spoke of cabins, not tents. People had cooked here, stored food, slept, worked. It wasn't just a stopover, it was a home, and what they didn't find was just as revealing. No weapons caches, no evidence of a battle or sudden flight. The area was clean, intentional, chosen. For centuries, the Roanoke mystery was built on the idea of disappearance. But Site X began flipping that idea on its head. Maybe they didn't vanish. Maybe they simply moved, quietly, intelligently, with purpose. This site wasn't about survival. It was about adaptation. And just a few miles away, another piece of the puzzle would surface. Site Y and the puzzle of persistence. Roughly 2 miles from Site X, in a quiet stretch of woodland, threaded by a narrow river, another dig began. This one on a hunch. The location didn't appear on any colonial maps. No name, no known connection to John White's journals, just a subtle rise in the ground, marked by unusual plant growth saw in small clusters of debris visible from satellite scans. But what archaeologists unearthed at this unnamed site would reshape everything. This location, now called Site Y, was unlike Site X in one crucial way. It didn't feel purely English. The materials pulled from the soil were mixed, and the deeper they dug, the clearer the story became. This was a place where two worlds had blended. Scattered among the layers were European tools, rusted knives, bent nails, iron buckles. But right beside them were Native American pottery shards, polished beads, and carved stone tools. Not just relics buried together, but pieces that had clearly been used in tandem. A shard of green glass, likely from an English bottle, had been refashioned into an arrowhead. Iron scraps were woven into native binding material, an English clasp modified to close a deer hide pouch. These weren't trade items or war trophies. They were shared technologies, tools adapted for new lives in new ways. This wasn't colonization, it was integration, said one field researcher. For the first time, archaeology caught up with what local tribal elders had always said, that some of the Roanoke colonists had not vanished or been killed. They had stayed and lived among them. The findings gave rise to what scholars now call the fragmentation theory, the idea that the colony didn't fail in one sweeping event. It simply fractured. Under pressure, under threat, under isolation, the settlers did what people have always done when cut off from their homeland. They found a way to survive. Some went inland to Site X, carving out a life away from the coast. Others took a different path, choosing to merge into surrounding tribal communities. At Site Y, we see that decision written in iron and clay. It wasn't abandonment, it was adaptation. There are no English graves at Site Y, no musket fire remnants, no fortifications. This wasn't a battlefield or a final stand. It was a shared space, a zone of cooperation, perhaps of intermarriage, perhaps of shared harvests and fireside storytelling. These weren't desperate castaways. They were people making strategic choices to blend in, to live under the protection of those who knew the land, to start over without drawing attention. Site Y may never give us names. We may never know who held the tools now laid in dirt, but it gives us something just as important, a record of persistence, a message buried in the earth, that not all survival is loud and not all resilience looks heroic. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's anonymous, but it endures. And while Site Y gave us the proof, the island where the mystery began, Croatoan, had been telling this story all along. The final pieces were waiting there, hidden not by time, but by our refusal to listen. Hatteras Island and the story that was always there. For over 4 centuries, the story of Roanoke was told as a disappearance. But it turns out the real story may have been sitting in plain sight the entire time. On the island now known as Hatteras, formerly called Croatoan, the trail that John White couldn't follow finally came into focus. This was the island the settlers carved into wood before they vanished. It was the one place White never reached. turned back by storms just miles from the truth. And on this island, generations of oral history had kept the story alive. The local Croatian people spoke of fair-haired children, English last names, and ancestors who came from the sea. But for centuries, that oral history was treated like folklore, not evidence. That changed in the 21st century. Led by local historian and researcher Scott Dawson, a team began excavating the island with new eyes. What they found rewrote the ending to America's oldest mystery. Fragments of a rapier hilt, unmistakably English, turned up beside traditional native tools. Gun parts, unlike any made or traded after the 16th century, were unearthed beside oyster shells in woven baskets. A piece of slate, scratched with English letters, suggested writing had continued long after the official colony was declared lost. These weren't random artifacts washed ashore. They were clustered, purposeful, domestic. They didn't disappear, they blended, Dawson said, and the people here never forgot. DNA evidence from Lumbee and Croatian descendants added weight. Genetic markers linked back to pre-1600 European ancestry, far earlier than any Jamestown or Plymouth connections. That meant the story passed down by these communities wasn't just legend, it was history, ignored, dismissed, and finally validated. Site after site across Hatteras showed signs of deep cultural blending. English iron tools reworked into native forms, beads repurposed, patterns interwoven. This wasn't invasion, it was collaboration. And it flips the narrative entirely. Instead of seeing the Roanoke settlers as victims of disaster, we begin to see them as agents of change, people who adapted when abandoned by the empire that sent them, who traded walls for relationships, forts for forests, colonization for cohabitation. And the Croatoan people, they didn't just take in the colonists, they survived alongside them, shared food, language, and bloodlines. And as science advanced, the ground wasn't the only place the past began to speak. Science unlocks the past. For centuries, stories of Roanoke were tangled in myth, but modern science, quiet, patient, and precise, finally began to cut through the fog. Researchers turned to tools that could see what human eyes missed. LiDAR swept over forests, revealing long hidden paths and outlines of structures beneath the trees. What once looked like wilderness now whispered of roads, fields, and settlements, traces that matched colonial planning. Ground-penetrating radar dug even deeper. Beneath the surface at multiple sites, it picked up post holes, hearths, and refuse pits. Clear signs of long-term settlement. Not just people passing through. Not a rescue camp. Real homes. Soil chemistry offered another layer. Patches of unusually rich soil suggested places where animals had been kept, fires had burned, and human waste had collected. Signs of sustained human life. And they matched perfectly with 16th century timelines. But the biggest leap forward came from DNA analysis. Researchers worked with Native American tribes who had long claimed ancestry from the Roanoke settlers. Genetic sequencing revealed markers of European ancestry dating back before Jamestown. In other words, the genes didn't come from later colonists. They came from Roanoke. That discovery flipped the entire timeline. For decades, American history started at Jamestown, 1607. But Roanoke now appears not just earlier, but more deeply embedded in the continent than anyone realized. They weren't lost, they were first. And what they left behind wasn't just relics, it was the very foundation of what would become the American story. Survival through adaptation, through blending, not conquest. Artifacts like metal fasteners, fragments of armor, and Elizabethan pottery matched exactly what was used in the 1580s. These weren't trade items. They weren't recycled goods. They belonged to people who lived, cooked, hunted, wrote, and eventually raised families right here. Even linguistics offered clues. Some tribal dialects in North Carolina preserve words that seem to echo Old English phrasing. Subtle, faint, but real. Each discovery chipped away at the old myth of disappearance and replaced it with a story of resilience. This wasn't about a failed colony, it was about a people who refused to die when history tried to erase them. They lived on, not in textbooks, but in genes, in stories, and now in the data. And then, in 2020, the most personal clue of all was found, one that changed everything. The 2025 breakthrough. For decades, the search for Roanoke settlers unfolded in fragments: broken pottery, faded maps, ancestral DNA. But in 2025, one quiet discovery in the soil near Site X brought the story into sharp human focus. It wasn't a fort or artifact this time, it was a burial. The skeleton was delicate, tucked carefully in a Christian-style grave. Arms crossed, head eastward. Nearby lay a worn rosary bead and a small copper brooch. The bones, long turned to a pale ivory hue, told their own quiet story. The individual was female, between 25 and 35 years old, and the forensic data was clear. She was of European descent. But here's the twist. Her DNA didn't match any Jamestown lineage, and she didn't match the earlier 1585 all-male expeditions. She was part of the Roanoke Colony. Her presence erased centuries of theory in a single silent moment. She didn't vanish. She lived. She died. She was buried with care and ritual. This wasn't the site of a massacre or a mass grave. It was a settlement, and she had been part of it. Forensic pathologists found no trauma, no signs of illness. She hadn't been attacked or starved. Her bones suggested she had lived a full life in the region, her teeth worn in a way consistent with native food preparation. Her body bore the faint imprint of physical labor, of walking long distances barefoot. But she wasn't suffering, she had adapted. The brooch she wore, English in design but altered, likely refashioned by native hands. It was a physical metaphor for what the Roanoke story had become, something hybrid, blended, and deeply human. The grave was dated to between 1593 and 1597. That timeline fit only one group, the missing colonists. When the announcement was made, one of the archaeologists whispered, "This is terrifying, because now we know." Not knowing had always made the story safer, but this grave made it real. These were no longer rumors or myths. These were people who had to make impossible decisions in an unforgiving world. Some went inland, some went to Croatoan, and some, like this woman, stayed right here. The emotional weight of this discovery hit harder than any artifact or map. For centuries, Virginia Dare had symbolized a lost beginning, but now the remains of a woman like her, possibly even a relative, were unearthed. She wasn't a symbol anymore. She was a person. And in that moment, the entire narrative shifted, from mystery to memory. And what we remember now changes what we choose to forget. The real legacy of Roanoke. The Roanoke Colony wasn't a failure. It wasn't a ghost story. It was an origin story, just told in the wrong voice for far too long. What we've called lost was never truly gone. The settlers didn't vanish. They fractured, they adapted, and they became something new. Some went to Croatoan, integrating with the island's tribes. Others moved inland to Site X and built homes. Still others coexisted and raised families with native peoples near Site Y. The proof is in their tools, their bones, their blood. The only thing that vanished was the will to remember them properly. For centuries, the Roanoke story was shaped by silence. John White's silence, historical silence, and the long dismissal of native oral traditions. The mystery became more important than the truth because a mystery sells. But a real story, one of survival, cultural fusion, and quiet persistence, that asks us to look deeper. It also challenges how we define success. The colonists didn't build cities, they didn't plant flags, they didn't conquer. But they survived. And in doing so, they left behind a more honest foundation for what it means to be American. Resilience, diversity, and shared struggle. In the bones of a woman buried with care, in the words passed down by the Lumbee and Croatoan tribes, in pottery fused from two cultures, we find a different kind of monument. Not one carved in marble, but grown in soil. Roanoke wasn't erased, it was absorbed. It flowed into the land, into the languages, into the faces of people who still walk those forests and islands today. And that's the tragedy, not that they disappeared, but that we stopped looking, that we allowed myth to override memory, that we ignored the quiet truths in favor of louder fictions. But now the silence is over. Roanoke isn't just a mystery to solve, it's a history to reclaim. They were never truly lost. We just forgot to remember. Roanoke was never a ghost story. It was a beginning we buried. The settlers didn't fail. They adapted, integrated, and endured. We didn't lose them. We stopped looking. But the truth is here now, carved not in trees but in the ground beneath our feet, and we can't ignore it anymore.